I want you to appreciate this. I did this just for you. For a panel called Expanding Islands. Bigger, browner, better. And you'll, better, not butter. I'll take batter though. You'll also appreciate this. This was, Ty will remember he got one too, except not XXX. That it was gifted to us by the Pacific Medical Association in New Zealand, which is the professional association of Pacific Islander nurses and doctors. And I've spent the last 2 years since I've had this trying to figure out, right, when diabetes and overweight and, you know, these things are real problems. But there's a point that I also wore this. When we arrived a few days ago, the first thing we did was meet up with, there's a small community up in Wahiawa that's very important to us, a community from Polowat, and we went to connect with them and spend the day. And one of the women who I hadn't seen for 20 years came running up. She gave me a really big hug, and she goes, Vince, you're so fat. And there's a point here, besides being true. I put on a lot of weight over the past 20, since I've seen her. That's also the time period that I left Guam and did, you know, pretty high mucka intellectual work in mainland, our Research One universities, right? There's something about balance here that I'm going to get to, right? Damon stated really nicely, I thought, the question about institutions and leadership, and especially the need for paying attention and the possibilities around decolonization, but in some kind of critical relationship to those islands that have also been had gone through decolonization, rather, given that a lot of us are coming from heavily colonized places. I want to talk a little bit about the personal and the embodied, the very visceral stakes that's involved here. The other thing that I forgot, I didn't mention about what Damon said was how ethnic studies politicizes things. And in many respects, as someone who did not come up through ethnic studies and only got to ethnic studies when I moved to the University of Michigan, my big takeaway was that it was the politicization of knowledge by ethnic studies that got a lot of us into trouble. Dean put that picture up there, and that was right on. It was the beginnings of calling out the power inequalities in knowledge production that really got a lot of us in trouble. But the thing that I'm working my way to that physicality and the personal stakes, in addition to the importance of the politicization of knowledge in ethnic studies, one of the things that was, to me, really salient here, that really brought it home, was how personal, how physical, and how individual the stakes are as well, and how we need to address those in the same way that we put in the rigor towards the intellectual work, but also the institutional work. It's about taking care of our bodies, kind of thing, you know, and yeah, like I know how to do that, right? The idea of expanding an island is actually part of a system that includes contracting the islands as well. You expand an island in many different ways to enlarge the target that you can head to. And PAFU, the so-called star compass, begins to get you in that direction. But at a certain point, You don't go to the stars anymore. You go to other forms of bearing, right? More localized forms of bearing. And then you have to start contracting that target. So you start honing in. The effective navigator is as adept at expanding the island to making that general direction as he or she is contracting it so that you can zoom right in. This is especially important. This is one of the reasons why it survived in the atolls, because the atolls are hard to see. They're small. They don't have mountains. So you have to be especially adept at doing that kind of thing. As much as ethnic studies needs to expand many different things, how it theorizes indigeneity, for example, right? It also has to learn when to contract to that. As when, for example, Damon reminded us last night that sometimes we're dealing with questions of scale. When in the scale of Asia and Pacific, islanders get forgotten. They get covered over, right? And that's the time when we have to learn to shrink it back to, and this is second nature to us, that site, place specificity. Indigeneity, if we have to expand it, also must never, ever, ever forget where it's from. In fact, that's the starting point, right? It's the ground you sit in that you stand on that matters. It's what makes indigeneity indigenous, right? And so one must never forget that. One of the biggest contradictions of a moment at the University of Michigan where we had, almost a dozen Pacific Islander scholars, people who spent their lives struggling for ethnic studies, pounding the tables, will really appreciate this. The biggest contradiction of amassing these resources was that none of that happened with the Pacific Islander pounding the doors for Pacific Islander programming. And they like to congratulate themselves over there. They like to say it was on intellectual merit. You know that one, right? As if ethnic studies is just a political concession, affirmative action, you know, something a bone to throw. That contradiction was really important because it's a question about accountability and the risks of producing knowledge in a place that is not accountable to specific places and specific communities. That reconnection with that friend, that woman from Polowat, and the fact that the first thing she noticed was how fat I've become, was also a way about how disconnected I had become. It really was. There's a message here about learning when to expand and when to contract. I know physically, for example, at one level, it's time to contract. Right? I also want to say this. When I was in school here, part of the reasons why ethnic studies wasn't on my radar was because you did not have all the Micronesians that you had at the time. But now you do, and we know what's going on. And by the way, I think you need to hire Micronesian scholars in ethnic studies. Hint, hint. I know two who are on the market. But the point is about how these things are very personal, and they're visceral, and they're embodied. And if we are not balanced, here I'm talking to myself, if we're not balanced between all the requirements of this, right, we get lost. Thank you.